May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. While church bells rang across Britain and crowds danced in Trafalgar Square, a very different scene was unfolding in a muddy field outside Hamburg. The command came quietly, almost gently, but it sliced through the tension like a knife through butter. "Take it slowly." The German women froze, their eyes widened. They looked at each other, then at the British soldiers kneeling before them with bowls of hot soup and spoons held carefully in their hands. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. They had heard the stories, the whispers that traveled through the camps, the rumors that kept them awake at night. They had imagined the worst scenarios, rehearsed them in their minds until fear became their constant companion. And now, as the British soldiers edged closer, lifting those spoons toward trembling lips, a single thought rippled through the group like ice water through veins. Why are they feeding us by hand? What are they planning to do to us? Stay until the end to understand the devastating truth behind that moment, and why the women's terror transformed into something none of them could have predicted. In the final desperate months of the war, Germany was hemorrhaging from within. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, was crumbling after barely 12. Cities lay in ruins, reduced to skeletal remains of their former glory. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, great metropolises transformed into landscapes of rubble and ash. The infrastructure that had once been the pride of German engineering now consisted of severed railways, bombed bridges, and roads cratered beyond recognition. Food had become more precious than gold. The ration cards that civilians clutched desperately provided barely enough calories to sustain life. Black markets thrived in the shadows, where a loaf of bread might cost a family heirloom, where desperate mothers traded wedding rings for powdered milk. The sophisticated supply chains that had fed the German war machine for years had completely broken down. Warehouses stood empty. Farms lay abandoned. Their workers either dead, conscripted, or fled. For the women serving in auxiliary military roles, conditions were even more precarious. These weren't combat soldiers, but they were integral to Germany's war effort nonetheless. They had been clerks meticulously filing reports in underground bunkers, their fingers stained with carbon paper and ink. They had been radio operators, headphones clamped over their ears for hours on end, relaying coded messages they didn't fully understand. They had been Flakeren, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, scanning the skies for Allied bombers, operating searchlights and early warning systems, loading ammunition for the guns that fired desperately at the waves of aircraft overhead. They had marched for days when their positions were overrun, sleeping rough in abandoned barns and burned-out houses. They survived on whatever they could. Scavenged stale bread so hard it had to be soaked in water. Potatoes with more rot than flesh. Wild plants they weren't entirely sure were safe to eat. Some went days without anything substantial crossing their lips. Their bodies grew thin, their faces hollow. Their uniforms, once fitted and pressed, now hung loose on gaunt frames. By the time British forces reached them in those final chaotic weeks, their bodies were fragile vessels of exhaustion. Their nerves stretched taut as piano wire, and their trust in anyone, even each other, had eroded to almost nothing. They expected harsh treatment. The propaganda they had consumed for years told them the enemy was ruthless, that the British were cold and calculating, that justice would be swift and merciless. They expected punishment for serving the regime even in their limited capacity. They expected to be treated as the enemy because that's precisely what they were. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what actually happened. The women were gathered in silence, corralled into a makeshift assembly area near what had once been a Worms supply depot. British soldiers approached with measured caution, but there was no aggression in their movements, no fury in their eyes. There were no shouted commands barked in anger, no rifle butts swung in violence, no immediate threats delivered with venom. Only orders spoken in calm, steady voices, sometimes in broken German, sometimes through interpreters. The women didn't trust it. How could they? Kindness from an enemy felt not just unlikely, but impossible. It contradicted everything they had been told, everything they had been trained to expect. It was a cognitive dissonance that left them dizzy with confusion. They were marched, though escorted might be more accurate, to a temporary internment camp that the British had established with surprising efficiency. Canvas tents stood in neat rows. Medical stations had been set up. Latrines had been dug in proper locations away from water sources. The organization was methodical, almost businesslike. The women were given blankets, not threadbare scraps, but actual wool blankets that held warmth. They were told to rest, to sit down, to take the weight off their feet. But rest was a foreign concept now, an impossible luxury. Their bodies trembled from a potent cocktail of exhaustion, hunger, and fear of what horrors might still await them in the coming hours. Some of the younger women wept quietly, trying to hide their tears. Others sat rigid with tension, eyes darting toward every movement, every shadow. The older ones, those who had lived through the First World War's aftermath, wore expressions of grim resignation, preparing themselves for whatever judgment was coming. Then it arrived on the wind, a smell that made several women gasp involuntarily. It was the aroma of warm food, real food. Not the watery girl they had subsisted on, not the moldy scraps they had fought over, but actual cooked food with substance and nourishment. The kind of meal they hadn't seen in months, some even longer. The smell of meat, of vegetables cooked in stock, of fresh bread still warm from wherever the British had their field kitchens. Some women's stomachs cramped painfully at the scent. Others felt saliva flood their mouths for the first time in weeks. But along with the desperate primal hunger came a new fear. Sharper, deeper, more psychologically confusing than anything they had felt before. British soldiers began moving through the camp carrying large pots of stew, baskets of bread, and containers of hot tea. The women stared at the food with a mixture of desperate longing and deep suspicion. Their eyes followed every movement as bowls were filled, as chunks of bread were torn and placed beside the bowls. As steam rose invitingly from the liquid, some whispered among themselves in urgent, frightened tones. "It's a trick," one young woman insisted, her voice barely audible. "They want us to let our guard down." Others feared more immediate consequences. "If we eat too quickly, they'll punish us," another murmured, remembering harsh lessons from their own training camps, where grabbing for food had earned swift reprimands. But a darker fear lurked beneath even these concerns. A few believed something more sinister, something that had been planted by years of propaganda and wartime paranoia, that the food might be tainted, poisoned, that the enemy might finish what the war had started, quietly eliminating prisoners rather than dealing with the complications of holding them. "Why else would they feed us?" one woman asked, her logic twisted by starvation and fear. "We're the enemy. We cost them resources." It would be easier to. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The others understood. When the British soldiers began distributing the bowls, moving from woman to woman with deliberate care, the reaction was not gratitude, but apprehension. Hands reached out tentatively, then pulled back. Some women's hands shook so badly from weakness, from anxiety, from the sheer overwhelm of the moment that they couldn't hold the spoon steady. The utensils clattered against the metal bowls, creating a nervous percussion that echoed through the camp. Others were simply too weak. Days without adequate food had left them with trembling limbs and diminished motor control. Their fingers couldn't grip properly. Their arms lacked the strength to lift even a lightweight spoon repeatedly from bowl to mouth. The British soldiers noticed this immediately. They had been briefed, had been trained, had seen similar situations in other liberated areas. They exchanged glances, some concerned, some sympathetic, all determined. Then they made a decision that the German women absolutely did not understand. The soldiers began to kneel down beside the women. They took the spoons gently from trembling fingers. They dipped the utensils into the bowls, carefully gauging the temperature, the portion size, and then they lifted the spoons toward the women's mouths and spoke words that would freeze every prisoner in place. "Take it slowly, Lancome. Slowly now." The British soldiers leaned in, offering those first spoonfuls by hand, as one might feed a child or someone bedridden with illness. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The women recoiled as if struck. Some physically jerked backward, their backs pressing against whatever was behind them. Others flinched so hard that nearby women started as well, creating a ripple effect of panic. One woman turned her head away entirely, her eyes squeezed shut, her entire body rigid with terror. They didn't know why the soldiers were doing this. The action made no sense within any framework they could comprehend. They didn't know if it was kindness or something else. Something far more sinister that their exhausted minds couldn't quite grasp, but their instincts screamed warnings about. Their thoughts raced through a maze of fear and confusion, each turn leading to darker possibilities. Why are they feeding us by hand like this? Are they mocking us? Is this humiliation before something worse? Why do they insist we eat slowly? Are they drawing this out? Do they want to watch us suffer? Is the poison slow acting? Why do they watch us so closely? What are they looking for? What reaction? What sign? The propaganda they had consumed for years roared back to life in their minds. Stories of enemy cruelty, of prisoners abused and degraded, of elaborate psychological tortures designed to break the spirit before destroying the body. Some of the women had worked in offices where reports from the Eastern Front had crossed their desks, reports that spoke of harsh treatment of German prisoners. If the Soviets were brutal, why would the British be any different? The tension in the camp was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. You could hear it in the shallow breathing, see it in the wide eyes and rigid postures, feel it in the air itself, which seemed to vibrate with collective anxiety. The British soldiers maintained their calm demeanor, but several looked troubled. This wasn't the reception they had anticipated. Some had sisters or mothers back home. Some had wives. Looking at these frightened women, hungry and terrified, stirred something uncomfortable in their chests. But they had their orders, and more importantly, they understood the medical necessity of what they were doing. "Come on now, love," one British corporal said gently to a young woman who couldn't have been more than 19. His Lancashire accent softened the words. "Just a small bite. Won't hurt you. Promise." The woman stared at him as if he was speaking an alien language, which in a sense he was. The concept of enemy compassion didn't translate into her experience. Hunger is a powerful force. It's not merely discomfort. It's a relentless biological imperative that eventually overrides almost everything else, including fear. The human body, when pushed to extremes, will take desperate measures to survive. One woman finally broke. She was perhaps in her mid-30s, old enough to have some perspective, young enough to have strength left. She had been a telephone operator in Berlin, spending long shifts in underground bunkers, connecting calls while the city burned above her. She had gone 3 days with almost nothing but water and a few bites of hard bread. She looked at the spoon being held patiently near her face. She looked at the British soldier holding it, a man with kind eyes and a patient expression, who looked like he might have been a shopkeeper or a teacher before the war. She looked at the other women, all frozen in the same paralysis of fear. Then she made her decision. Survival trumped terror. She opened her mouth just a little, just enough for the spoon to slip past her lips. The soup touched her tongue, warm, seasoned with actual pieces of potato and carrot and even some meat. The taste was so overwhelming after months of deprivation that tears immediately sprang to her eyes. She swallowed. The warmth traveled down her throat, hit her empty stomach, and her entire body seemed to sigh with relief. Nothing happened. No sudden pain, no bitter aftertaste, no immediate collapse, just warmth and nourishment and the first real food she had tasted in longer than she could remember. The British soldier smiled slightly. "There you are. Good. Another slowly now. Another spoonful. Another swallow." Other women watched this first pioneer with intense focus. When she didn't collapse, didn't cry out in pain, didn't show any signs of distress, something shifted in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it was there. Another woman opened her mouth to accept the spoon being offered to her. Then another, then another. Like dominoes falling, one by one, the women began to eat. The British soldiers kept up a steady stream of gentle encouragement, repeating the same phrases over and over. "Gently now, small bites, not too fast. Langam, Lansam. That's it. Easy does it." The women's eyes continued to dart around the camp, searching for the trap, waiting for the other shoe to drop, anticipating whatever horror they were certain must be coming. But nothing came. No pain, no cruelty, no punishment. Instead, something else began to happen. Something they hadn't experienced in so long they almost didn't recognize it. Their breathing began to steady, the shallow gasps deepening into more normal rhythms. Their shoulders, which had been hunched defensively around their ears, began to lower incrementally. Their hands, which had been balled into fists or clutching at their own clothes, slowly relaxed. The fear didn't vanish. That would take much longer, weeks or months for some, but it cracked just enough for something new to slip through those fissures. A tiny seed of something that might eventually grow into trust. Only later, after the bowls were empty and the women were resting, truly resting for the first time in days, did the full truth emerge. It came through interpreters, through the few women who spoke some English, through careful explanations from British medical officers who made rounds through the camp. The British soldiers weren't feeding them by hand to control them, to assert dominance, or to humiliate them. They weren't trying to mock their weakness or infantilize them as some form of psychological warfare. And they most certainly weren't trying to poison them. They were trying to save their lives. The women were so severely malnourished that their bodies had entered a dangerous state. Their digestive systems had slowed to a crawl, conserving energy, adapting to starvation. Their blood sugar was dangerously low. Their electrolyte balances were completely disrupted. Their stomachs had shrunk. Their bodies had begun consuming their own muscle tissue for energy, including potentially the muscles of the heart. In this condition, eating too quickly could be catastrophic. It could trigger something called refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal shift in fluids and electrolytes that occurs when nutrition is reintroduced too rapidly to someone who is severely malnourished. The sudden influx of food could cause the body to pull phosphate, potassium, and magnesium from the bloodstream into the cells to process the nutrients. This shift could lead to heart failure, respiratory failure, seizures, or coma. Additionally, their shrunken stomachs couldn't handle normal portions. Eating too much too fast would cause severe cramping, vomiting, and potentially dangerous intestinal blockages. Some women were so weak that even the act of eating, the physical effort required, could exhaust them dangerously if they tried to do it too quickly. The British soldiers had encountered this before. They had been briefed by medical officers who had experience with concentration camp liberations, with freed prisoners of war, with starving civilian populations. They had seen what happened when well-meaning soldiers gave starving people full rations and watched in horror as those people became violently ill or even died from the very food meant to save them. They knew the warning signs, the trembling hands, the hollow eyes, the loose clothing on skeletal frames, the yellowed skin, the brittle hair. They knew exactly how serious the situation was. And that was why they had made the decision to feed the women by hand, slowly, carefully, one small spoonful at a time. They needed to control the pace to ensure that the reintroduction of food happened gradually enough that these women's bodies could adapt and accept the nourishment without catastrophic consequences. The order that had sounded so strange, so frightening, so impossible to trust, "Take it slowly," was perhaps the most compassionate command any of these women had received in years. It was the difference between life and death delivered in two simple words. When the truth finally penetrated through the fog of fear and exhaustion, when the women finally understood what had actually happened and why, the reaction was profound. They had expected cruelty. For months, they had been preparing themselves mentally for harsh treatment, for retribution, for the rough justice of victors toward the vanquished. The propaganda had told them the British were vindictive, that prisoners would be treated with the same harshness Germany had shown to its own prisoners. They had expected punishment. They knew they had served the Reich even in minor capacities. They had operated the communications that coordinated military movements. They had helped operate the defenses that had shot down Allied aircraft with crews who had families waiting for them to come home. They expected to answer for that service, to pay some price for their part in the war machine. They had expected to be treated as the enemy because that's precisely what they were. Enemy combatants, enemy auxiliaries, women who had worn German uniforms and served German interests. Why would the British see them as anything else? Instead, they had been treated as human beings, as people in desperate need, as individuals whose lives had value, even though they had been on the opposite side of the war. The British had fed them carefully, patiently, gently, not because it was easy or convenient, but because their lives depended on it. The soldiers had knelt in the mud beside them. They had taken time from their own duties. They had handled spoons and bowls and measured out portions with meticulous care. They had spoken gently when they could have spoken harshly. They had shown patience when they could have shown indifference. The fear that had filled the camp at the beginning of that meal, the terror that had made women recoil from offered food slowly transformed into something else entirely. It was a complex mixture of emotions that would take weeks to fully process. Relief, profound and overwhelming, that they had survived not just the war, but also its immediate aftermath, that they were safe, at least for now. Gratitude, hesitant at first, but growing stronger for soldiers who had cared enough to protect them from themselves, from the danger that their own hunger posed. Disbelief that the people they had been taught to fear, to hate, to see as the existential enemy were the very ones keeping them alive. It challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. Shame for some at having believed the worst, at having feared kindness, at having been so thoroughly deceived by the propaganda they had consumed. Confusion because reconciling this reality with years of indoctrination was mentally and emotionally exhausting. And underneath it all, a fragile, tentative sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the future might not be as dark as they had feared. The feeding protocol continued for several days. The British medical officers monitored the women closely, tracking their recovery, adjusting portion sizes gradually as their bodies adapted. The progression was careful and calculated. Day 1, small amounts of warm broth and soft bread fed slowly under supervision. Day 2, slightly larger portions, introduction of mashed vegetables, continued supervision, but some women were deemed stable enough to feed themselves with guidance. Day 3, more varied nutrition, careful introduction of protein. Most women now eating independently, but still under watchful eyes. Day 4 and beyond. Gradual return to normal portions, though still well below what a healthy person would eat. Continued monitoring for any signs of complications. Throughout this process, something remarkable happened. The initial terror that had defined the first encounter began to dissolve. Not completely. Trust takes time to build, especially when it has been thoroughly destroyed, but incrementally, interaction by interaction, meal by meal. The women began to speak to the British soldiers tentatively at first. A few words of gratitude in broken English. Questions about what would happen to them. Small requests. Could they write to their families? Did anyone know what had happened to Hamburg? Was the war truly over? The soldiers responded with patience and whatever information they could share. Some brought cigarettes to distribute. Others played gramophones in the evening so there could be music. A few organized games for the younger women. Simple things like cards or makeshift football with rolled-up cloth. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some women remained deeply traumatized, struggling to accept kindness from those they had been taught to fear. Some were dealing with grief for lost family members, destroyed homes, a country that no longer existed in the form they had known. But overall, a shift occurred. What happened in that field outside Hamburg was not an isolated incident. Across occupied Germany in the spring and summer of 1945, British forces encountered thousands of German military personnel, both men and women, in various states of distress and malnutrition. The British Army had learned hard lessons about how to handle mass populations of displaced, defeated, and often desperately hungry people. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in April 1945 had been a horrifying education in what happens when starving people are given food too quickly. Despite the best intentions of British soldiers who opened their own rations to give to the emaciated prisoners, many died from the sudden reintroduction of rich food to systems that couldn't handle it. The medical officers who responded to that crisis developed protocols specifically to prevent such tragedies from repeating. These protocols were then applied across various situations to concentration camp survivors, to prisoners of war, to civilian refugees, and to captured German military personnel. The approach was the same. Assess the level of malnutrition, introduce food slowly and carefully, monitor for complications, and gradually increase portions as the body adapted. It was a massive logistical undertaking. The British Army was dealing with millions of displaced persons across occupied Germany. They had to establish order, provide security, begin the process of denazification, and somehow feed vast numbers of people whose infrastructure had been obliterated. That they took the time and care to do this properly, even for enemy combatants, speaks to both military discipline and a fundamental sense of humanity that survived even the brutality of 6 years of total war. In the decades after the war, some of these women shared their stories. Their accounts preserved in archives and oral histories provide a window into that extraordinary moment. "I thought they would beat us," one woman recalled in an interview conducted in the 1970s. "I thought at best they would ignore us and let us starve. When that British soldier knelt down beside me with that spoon, I was certain it was poisoned. I was certain I was about to die. When the food was real and I didn't die, I didn't know what to think. I had to rebuild my entire understanding of the world." Another woman who had been a radio operator in Bremen wrote in her memoirs, "The gentleness was what shocked me most. We had been told the British were cold and mechanical, but the soldier who fed me, his hands were shaking almost as much as mine. He looked worried. He called me dear in English. I didn't understand it then, but later someone translated, he was worried about me. About me who had been his enemy. I carry that with me always." A third account from a woman who had operated searchlights for anti-aircraft batteries. "I realized later that they saved my life that day. If they had just given us food and walked away, if they had let us eat as quickly as we wanted, I would have gorged myself. I would have eaten until I was sick, probably until I died. They knew this. They knew us better than we knew ourselves in that moment. That kind of care from an enemy. It changed something in me." The command, "Take it slowly," became for these women a defining moment in their lives. It was the point where their expectations collided with reality so dramatically that it forced a fundamental reassessment. They had been taught that the enemy was inhuman, that defeat would bring unspeakable horror, that capture meant the end of everything. Instead, defeat brought the careful rationing of soup. Capture meant medical attention. The enemy turned out to have medics who knew about refeeding syndrome and soldiers who would kneel in the mud to ensure prisoners ate safely. This cognitive dissonance, the gap between what they expected and what they received, was profound. It planted seeds of doubt about everything else they had been told. If the propaganda about the British was wrong, what else was wrong? If the enemy could show such humanity, what did that say about their own side's treatment of prisoners and occupied peoples? For some, it was the beginning of a long process of coming to terms with what the Reich had actually been, what it had done, and what they had been a part of, however peripherally. The kindness shown by British soldiers in those first desperate days became a reference point, a moment of clarity in the fog of propaganda and denial. It's worth noting that this experience was also significant for the British soldiers involved. Many of them were young men who had been fighting for years. They had seen friends die, had stormed beaches, had liberated concentration camps where the horrors they witnessed would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They would have been justified in viewing all Germans, even these auxiliary women, with hostility. The temptation to show hardness rather than compassion must have been present. Yet they chose humanity. Some soldiers wrote home about these experiences. Their letters reveal a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the war was over, pride in Britain's victory, but also a kind of weary sadness at the state of Germany and its people. One corporal wrote to his wife, "We're feeding German prisoners today, women mostly. They're terrified of us. It's strange to be feared like this when all we're doing is giving them soup." Makes you think about what they've been told about us. Makes you think about what we've been told about them, too. They're just people, love. Scared, hungry people. The war makes monsters of us all, I suppose. But underneath, we're still just people. This true story, documented in military records, oral histories, and personal accounts, represents something important about human nature, and about the choices we make even in the darkest circumstances. Wars create clear divisions. Us versus them, friend versus enemy, good versus evil. These divisions are necessary for armies to function, for soldiers to perform their duties, for nations to mobilize their populations toward victory. But these same divisions can blind us to our shared humanity. The British soldiers who fed those German women by hand, who knelt in the mud and patiently ensured each spoonful was safely consumed, who explained and reassured and showed care to people who had every reason to fear them. These soldiers chose to see human beings rather than just enemies, and the German women who had to overcome years of propaganda and immediate terror to accept that kindness, who had to rebuild their understanding of the world based on this unexpected mercy. They learned that enemies could be liberators, that defeat could bring salvation, that sometimes the darkest moments precede the light. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. While celebrations erupted across the Allied nations, in a muddy field outside Hamburg, a small group of German women learned a profound lesson about humanity, compassion, and the unexpected places where mercy can be found. The command, "Take it slowly," was initially terrifying. It represented everything they feared about being at the mercy of their enemies. But it became the moment they realized they were finally in safe hands. The people they had been taught to fear had become their protectors. The enemy had become their salvation. This is a true World War II story, preserved in the accounts of those who lived it, documented in military records, remembered in the testimonies of women who experienced it and soldiers who provided it. It reminds us that even in total war, even in the complete collapse of a society, even when every reason exists for vengeance and cruelty, humanity can still prevail. Sometimes mercy arrives from the last place you expect. Sometimes the enemy turns out to be the one who saves your life. Sometimes a simple command, "Take it slowly," becomes the moment everything changes. The women who experienced this never forgot it. Neither did the soldiers who provided it. It became a story passed down, a testament to the possibility of compassion, even in the most unlikely circumstances. A reminder that we are all ultimately human beings capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary kindness. The choice of which path we take, even in the darkest moments, remains ours too.